Welcome back to Shadow and Light. Today we're talking about something that can really be uncomfortable looking in the mirror and realizing that sometimes we might be a part of the problem too. It's easy to point fingers and blame other people and focus on what they did wrong. But sometimes the hardest thing we can do is turn mirror towards ourselves and honestly ask what part of this belongs to me. The mirror might be rude today, but sometimes the truth shows us exactly what we need to grow, why this way was made. I created this way because I had to realize that sometimes the problem weren't just anyone else's. There were times when I had to take an honest look at myself and realize that I was part of the problem too. I had to take responsibility for the ways I tried to control things when I was afraid of losing control. For a long time, I was really good at blaming others for how I'm feeling. I, I used to say they made me feel this way. Blamed him for my overthinking, saying if they would have talked to me better, I wouldn't be overthinking right now. I blamed others for difficulty letting go. It's like I want to hold on to that person for no reason. I blame others for conflict. I focus on what they did wrong and not on my side. But most important of all, I blame others when things don't go according to my plan. It was easier to focus on what other people were doing wrong because it meant I didn't have to look at my own choices, my own reactions, or the ways I was trying to control things out of fear. But eventually I had to ask myself a really uncomfortable question. What if, what part of this was actually mine? When I started looking at myself honestly, I realized I wasn't always the victim of the chaos. Sometimes I was helping create it. I had to admit some of my choices, reactions, or behaviors were a part of the problem. And let me tell you, that was one uncomfortable mirror to look into. But it is necessary, and the more you do it, the better the reflection gets. Taking accountability does not mean blaming yourself for everything that goes wrong. Taking responsibility for someone else's actions. Apologizing just to keep the peace. Ignoring your feelings or needs, or allowing someone else to mistreat you because you made a mistake. Taking accountability does mean admitting when you were wrong instead of making excuses. Stop blaming others for choices that were yours. Change the behavior, not just apologize for it, and learn from your mistakes instead of repeating the same behavior. But once I admitted it, I was finally able to take responsibility for my actions again, learn from my mistakes, and start making different choices. And let me tell you, the mirror was rude, and it had absolutely no problem pointing it out. This way reminds me that I can't change what I refuse to acknowledge. What did my own nonsense look like? When I think about things I had to take accountability for, one of the biggest things was realizing that my actions or reactions could sometimes add to the chaos I was already dealing with. I used to handle situations by holding all of my feelings in until I exploded. Sometimes instead of admitting that I was wrong, I would point out what the other person did wrong instead. It was easier to do that than admit I was a part of the problem. One behavior I have had and I am still working on, to be completely honest with you and myself, is avoiding difficult conversations. I didn't realize that when I was avoiding difficult conversations, I was avoiding the opportunity to take responsibility for my part. I thought I was keeping the peace, but sometimes I was only making the situation worse by putting it off. Some of my actions affected other people by making them feel like they aren't being heard and like their feelings don't matter. I had to stop asking, why does everyone keep doing this to me? And start asking, what did I do to myself? My story. One situation where I had to take a really honest look at myself was in a friendship where I wasn't communicating when something was bothering me. Instead of having the difficult conversation, I would keep things to myself because I didn't want to create conflict or risk losing the friendship. At the time, I thought the pattern was the other person, not understanding how I felt, but how they can understand if I don't tell them. I remember feeling frustrated because I thought they should have known something was wrong or realized that their actions hurt me. I was so focused on being understood that I forgot I also needed to step back and understand their side. My part in this situation was that I wasn't communicating my feelings and expecting the person to just magically know. I kept things to myself and let frustrations build. The hardest part to admit was the fact that people in my life are not mind readers. I have to actually use communication. I could have just communicated better and maybe frustrations wouldn't have just increased. The realization humbled me and I had to sit there and realize, oh, maybe I'm not always right. If I could go back and talk to myself during that situation, I would say stop expecting them to know what you're feeling when you haven't even told them. Take a breath, stop assuming the worst, and have the uncomfortable conversation. You don't have to be afraid of speaking up. If this friendship is meant to grow, it is going to be a lot more helpful than silence. What does taking accountability teach me? One thing I am learning to do is step back and take a look at myself and figure out what part is actually mine instead of pointing the finger at someone else. When something is bothering me, instead of avoiding the conversation, I try to write down my feelings and read them to the person or message it to them. I say it calmly and do not immediately go to blaming the other person. I am learning that I can admit when I'm wrong without having freak out moments or shutting down. I am learning that taking accountability does not mean talking down to myself or dismissing my own feelings. One thing I want to remind myself is when I'm tempted to get defensive, is that taking accountability can actually help the situation. I can also be open minded to hear the other person's side. I may not always handle things perfectly, but I can learn from my mistakes, communicate honestly, and choose to do better next time. The biggest lesson I've learned about accountability is that it does not mean blaming myself for everything. And honestly, sometimes growth is just looking in the mirror and saying, okay, you could have handled that better, but that's okay because sometimes that's needed. Let's talk about you. Now, I want you to take a moment and ask yourself, is there a situation where you've been focused on what someone else did wrong without looking at your own part? Is there a difficult conversation you've been avoiding? If so, what are you afraid that might happen if you have this conversation? Is there something that you need to apologize for, communicate, or take responsibility for? Or asking yourself, how could I have handled that situation differently? And remember, taking accountability does not mean beating yourself up. It means being honest enough to recognize your part so you can go from it. So this week, I want you to look in the mirror, not to judge yourself, but to ask yourself, what was my part? And if the mirror makes you uncomfortable, well, welcome to the club, because apparently mine has been rude too. This week's accountability challenge. Before we finish this week, I want to give you a little challenge for this week. I want you to think of one situation where you might need to ask yourself, what is my part in this? Write down what happened, what was my part, what could I have done differently? Is there a conversation I need to have? What can I do differently next time this situation comes up if it happens again? Please don't use this exercise to beat yourself up. Use it to understand yourself better. Because accountability isn't about saying I'm a terrible person, it's about saying I can do better and I'm willing to try. And if your mirror starts getting a little too rude while you're doing this, just remind it that we're working on things. If there's one thing that I hope you take away from today's episode, it is that we are not perfect, but we can learn from our mistakes. We can communicate effectively and not shut down or freak out. Taking accountability does not mean beating yourself up. It means being honest enough to look in the mirror, recognize your part, and choose to grow. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'll see you next time on Shadow and Light. And remember, if the mirror is rude today, maybe, just maybe, it's trying to help. Thank you all.